Hey, welcome back to another video. This is the follow-up video of the C300 versus the Blackmagic URSA Mini 4.6K. Man, that's a mouthful. I was going to separate all of these out into separate videos, but then I discovered that there's not a huge difference between all of them, so it doesn't really justify making a separate video for all of them. So this is all of the different tests that I did between the cameras. I did a dynamic range test, I did a color profile test, slow motion, and low light. I'm gonna give you my final thoughts now, and then if you're interested, you can keep watching and see the actual tests. My final thoughts are this. The two cameras are basically comparable. As far as dynamic range, they're about the same. Low light, obviously C300 just dominates, completely dominates. Color profile, C300 has far more options, but is also a pain in the neck to work with in post. I don't love working with MXF files, but if you're shooting RAW, that's also a pain in the neck to work with. So it just depends on what your workflow is. But ProRes is easy as all get up to work with. And then slow motion, the two are basically the same. There's a slight difference in crop factor, but the two basically have the same type of slow motion. The 4.6K has a tiny one up in that it shoots 2K versus 1080 in slow motion, so one tiny little perk there. And then obviously the URSA Mini shoots RAW, and that gives you far more flexibility in post to work with the image. So that's my overview of everything. Let's jump into each one and talk about them. If you're still interested, keep watching. If not, there you go. There's a very brief overview of my takeaway from the two cameras. Okay, first off, I wanted to do a dynamic range test, and I did the two cameras out a window, and I shot at a bunch of different f-stops to kind of give an idea of how bright it was, and then I did a quick color correction on it to see how much of that background and how much of the shadows you can save. So I shot everything in log 3 gamut. That has found the sweet spot for me, where contrast is kind of already set a little bit, and it's a lot easier to color correct, but you still have a lot of the information in dynamic range. I did notice that the shadows in the Blackmagic 4.6K held up a little better. It wasn't quite as crunchy or contrasty, a little easier to work with in the shadows, until obviously you got to the low light test, which we'll talk about later. But you can see here at an f16, the difference between Blackmagic. You know, there's a little bit more, especially if you look around the eye, quite a bit more detail in the shadow in the eye. So not a huge difference, but just a little bit. The dynamic range was basically, to me, very comparable, looked basically the same. So there you have it. Let's go into slow motion. Here's obviously you want slow motion of a cat jumping around after a little dog, little stuffed dog. Great slow motion. And the slow motion between the two looked basically the same quality of slow motion. Like I didn't notice any like artifacting or any weird stuff that you sometimes get when you go into slow motion. The motion all looked very smooth. It looked gorgeous on both cameras. Now, this is one thing that's kind of important to note. At the 4.6K, you can do 2K RAW, 120 frames per second, which is amazing. I shot everything ProRes because I didn't need the capability of RAW at that time. And then here's a comparison side by side of the two cameras. So again, the test was just kind of like, well, I didn't really learn much there. Cool. They both do slow motion really well. All right, now let's go into the low light test. This one is the obvious one. The 800 ISO URSA Mini and the C300, they look very comparable. Obviously I have the blue tint because I forgot to do the sensor calibration, the black shade calibration on the URSA Mini 4.6K, so sorry about that. That's why it looks a little blue. And then 1600, the C300 looks awesome, and the 4.6K looks grainy at 1600. And then I went up to 3200. Yeah, so then I went up to 25,600 and you can see here, it's still, even at that super high ISO, you can start seeing some pretty bad grain, but it's not that bad. It's not like the 1600 on the URSA Mini. So yeah, so that's the comparison there. Obviously, the C300 just dominated. So then the last thing between the two cameras that I noticed was color profiles. So I made, and I have another video kind of talking about the color profiles of the C300, so you can check that one out. If it's not out yet, it will be shortly. But the thing with the C300 is it does give you huge flexibility within the camera to set kind of a look that you want and how you want to deal with it in post. I find that S-Log3 at Gamma is my personal favorite because it gives you a decent contrast from the get-go with still saving most of the data of the dynamic range. Here's a bunch of different shots from the different color profiles. I have them listed down below here, and you can just kind of see how things react. So yeah, that's kind of showing all the different profiles of the color. And then of course I did the URSA Mini, which gives you the option of video or film. To many of you, this video may seem kind of useless, and partly I don't see a huge difference between the two cameras. One costs more but gives you way better low light. One's less expensive but also gives you RAW. So there's these compromises between the two cameras. But as far as image goes, they give you pretty comparable to the same image. I would argue the fact that the C300 has a little bit more of a broadcast look, very slightly, not a ton. You'd be hard pressed to say, oh, that's a broadcast camera, but I feel like the skin tones of the 4.6K and color correcting the two, the 4.6K, I enjoy color correcting the 4.6K over the C300. It's a little easier to color correct and maintain those skin tones. I find it a little bit more of an enjoyable experience. I also prefer editing ProRes footage versus the MFX files from the C300, which are kind of clunky in Premiere. So those are kind of the pros and cons of it. As far as the image goes and what they look like, they are very comparable to each other, other than low light. If you're gonna do low light, definitely do the C300, but we'll see how everything pans out when the URSA Mini Pocket cinema camera comes out and they claim that it does much lower light. We'll see how that actually pans out. But as far as getting a cinematic look, actually, I have wanted for a long time to do a comparison video between the URSA Mini 4.6K and the C200. I shot one project with the C200 and I was super impressed with how well it maintained and the roll off of the highlights and maintained the highlights. It's shooting RAW and it's gorgeous. Really pretty image. Compared to the C300, it's night and day. The C200's image is just so much more buttery, I guess. I don't know how to explain it, but it's much more cinematic and it's gorgeous. So I want to do a comparison between those. I'm trying to get my hands on the C200 again. Just haven't had a chance to get my hands on it, but hopefully that's coming out soon. I hope this video was at all helpful for those of you that requested. I'm sorry it's not like dramatically different. I mean, the two cameras are pretty comparable to each other. There's not a huge dramatic difference between the two, especially if you have the URSA Mini Pro, which has the built-in NDs like the C300. I hope this was helpful. I hope this meant anything to you. I'm sorry if it was just kind of a rant from me about how the cameras are basically the same. I'm sorry. Anyway, thanks again for watching, guys. You are awesome. Thanks so much for your comments. Be sure to subscribe and check out my other videos. Thanks again. Peace.